And I'm the chair of the Royal Asiatic Society monograph, under which this excellent book has been published. Society has been publishing monographs for nearly 200 years. And while I haven't read all the monographs we published, I think I can say with some confidence that Dr. Olly Akkerman's Sumaiya Hamdani Treasury of books is among the very best in the time. It is remarkable for its scholarship. It's remarkable too because an extraordinary piece of ethnology, which is interwoven very successfully with scholarship, and makes the book in fact very easy to read, in fact hard to put down. I can't say that at most. That's got on. Now, Dr. Akkerman is a lecturer and research associate at the Institute of Islamic Studies in the Free University of Berlin. Before that, he was in Leiden, where she did an undergraduate and PhD degrees. But we're also joined today by Dr Sumaiya Hamdani, who is going to comment on what Dr. Akkerman is about to tell you. And Sumaiya Hamdani received her BA from Georgetown University and her MA and PhD in Princeton. She was the co-founder and the director of the Islamic Studies program at George Mason University, which she still teaches. Her special interests are in his Islamic history, with a particular focus on the medieval period in North Africa, Egypt, Shi'ism. And she's in many ways extremely well qualified to comment on what Dr. Akkerman said. So, Olly, well, there you are. Good. Will you come and tell us about your marvelous book?
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Robinson, for your very kind words. I'm very touched. And thank you, everyone, for coming this evening. Before I start my presentation, I would first like to thank the Royal Asiatic Society, and of course, Elephant Water in particular, not just for organizing this wonderful event, especially for getting the book published, which was quite a saga. I think some of you know that the book actually, where is it? Here it is. Oh, there's another one here. It's a book that is interdisciplinary and touches on different questions, cutting across various continents, communities. It's historical yet anthropological. And therefore, it was not only quite a challenging book to write, but also to get published. So I am very grateful to the Royal Asiatic Society and honored to have sort of this royal seal of the Royal Asiatic Society with this lovely elephant in the book. So thank you again, Alison, for all these awards.
Great pleasure.
I am really indebted to you. Of course, also, I would like to thank EUP and Royal University Press for all their efforts as well. And then I'm not sure if Zoom actually is working, but a big thank you to all my dear family members who have joined us online, as well as my friends and the larger academic community that has supported me in all of these years of writing the book. So actually, I cannot say anything about this book without extending my gratitude to those who feature in it so prominently. And that's the Alawi Bohra community in Baroda. Here we see the pictures, just to give you an impression. And the people of Badri Mohalla, as I refer to them in the book. So Badri Mohalla is a small Bohra lane, so to say, of the city, where the community is found. And in the year 2015, I spent several months among the Alawis living in the Mohalla, sort of participating in its daily rituals. And well, it's very simple. Without them, there would not have been a book. And I'm very touched by the generosity, hospitality, and especially also the patience, I should say, of everyone in Badri Mohalla. So for those of you who are not familiar with sort of the map of India and where Baroda is, you can see that here we are in the state of Gujarat. And the Alawi Bohras are actually one of three Bohra communities that we have today. So we have the Alawi Bohras, who can be found in Surat. Then we have the Sulaimani Bohras, who can be found in Hyderabad, and then the Alawi Bohras in Baroda. And we're talking of a community of roughly 10,000 believers who are spread all over the world, but their religious headquarters can be found here. Right, so here we see a few pictures of my field research, which initially was planned as archival work, because I'm actually trained as a classical philologist, but then quite accidentally turned out into a very ethnographic affair. To my great delight, but it was also quite a steep learning curve, as I also described in the book. And here we see a picture of some of the moving of the believers during the Ziyarat, which is the annual pilgrimage. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that there were only men in the community. There are obviously also a lot of women, and we will get to know them throughout the presentation. But just to sort of come back to my sort of the gratitude that I would like to extend is in particular to the Dawi Mutla of the community. He's sort of the head cleric. Sayyidina Sahib Zaki Hatimi, who is seated here on the right. And he is the spiritual temporal head of the community in the absence of what the believers believe to be the hidden Imam. And it was the Sayyidina Sahib and his two brothers, the Rasul Kubul Sahib and the Muqassir Sahib and their families, who really took me in as one of their own. And when I arrived in Baroda, I was a complete outsider, unmarried woman at the time, as well as, well, I was not from Gujarat, I wasn't even Muslim, let alone Bohra. And that was actually quite a big privilege and honor, given the fact that the Bohras, actually all Bohra communities, practice taqiyya, which means that they're a very close community, practicing secrecy, and usually they don't let outsiders in, excuse me. Right. So simply put, without sort of their guidance in a way, there would not have been a book. And initially, as an outsider, I was interested in one particular manuscript that I wanted to investigate philologically. But while I was I became part of the day-to-day life of the community, its rituals, I was forced to really out of my academic comfort zone. And from complete outsider, I was granted sort of the permission to work with the sacred manuscripts of the community. I gained the trust of basically clerics, and was then sort of upgraded as court historian, as well as sort of the royal cataloger, if you will, of its manuscript collection. And here we just have a slide of sort of how that starts. I mean, it's a very complex process, and in the book I write a lot about also my positionality and how it's not always easy accessing the manuscripts, especially as a woman, because to the believers, these manuscripts are not just dusty books, they are in fact sacred objects that can only be accessed by the highest clerics of the community, who are all male. So it was quite a mission impossible when I was there. So this is just sort of an idea of how this went. In fact, Sumaiya, I chose this slide because so I was making notes of the manuscripts that I would catalog, which, I mean, this gave me a wonderful opportunity to actually see all the manuscripts and sort of become acquainted with their materiality. But this particular manuscript, actually, provenance was, it was a Hamdani manuscript, so I put this in for you. Right, so this is how I work from day to day. I look at a pile of manuscripts from the Sayyid Sahib, who he selected these manuscripts, and I would I would measure them, I would date them, and while doing so, I was basically seated in the religious headquarters of the clerics. So I had my little corner where I would catalog the manuscripts by hand. And in the afternoon, we had the Dai and I had our what I call our manuscript sessions. So obviously there were a lot of differences between us, and people asked me a lot, so how did the interviews go? But there was no way of doing interviews. I, as someone who came from the outside, who officially had to be initiated, who was asked to take oaths of secrecy, was not in any position to say, so, Sayyid Nasir, how, how is it going? That was not at all my position. But through the language of manuscripts, because we were both bibliophiles, like it is sort of part of the tradition of the community that the Dai is the head custodian of the manuscripts. But also on a personal level, the Dai was a manuscript lover, and so was I. So we found a common language, which was the language of book covers, of colophons, of letter bindings, of all of these beautiful things that we find around. We found a common language, right? And it is basically through these conversations, through these sessions, that I learned to look at manuscripts through a completely different lens than what I was used to. And that brings me to the idea of social codicology, which was one of sort of the main, and I see Annabelle already like, yes, I know, I've heard this before. That's sort of one of the main points of the book. While I was in Baroda and I was cataloging in the little corner of the office of the Dai, I suddenly realized that these manuscripts that I was cataloging were so much more than books from the past. I saw that they were used for healing, for divination practices. I saw secret objects that cannot be accessed. They actually became very important symbolic objects, dividing the community between those who could access them and those who couldn't. So for me, after coming back from the field work, my perspective had changed so much. And I mean, there are many anecdotes in the book you can read about them if you're interested. That, well, I basically, wrote a very different book than when I started. So what I propose in the book is sort of this idea of social codicology, moving away from the way we look at manuscripts. At least that's how I was traditionally trained, as does the sort of inert objects from the past, and look at the active role that people take and sort of their relationship with manuscripts as bibliophiles, as collectors, as copyists, as readers, as scholars. So the main question of the book, yes, it is about the Fatimids, and it is about codicology, and it's about anthropology and secrecy, but it's actually a very simple one, which is what is it that people do with their books, in this case, entries and manuscripts, and why? Why do communities such as the Alawi Bohras, why do they painstakingly make the effort to collate, copy, preserve, and enshrine manuscripts over centuries? I mean, towards the end of my stay, was also initiated into the practice of manual copying, because what makes these manuscript repositories so special is that they're living manuscript cultures. These manuscripts are not allowed to be printed due to their esoteric content. And therefore, I know a little bit what it means to copy manuscripts by hand. I mean, there's a reason why the Bohra clerics refer to it as a jihad. It is a jihad, a personal jihad in a way, because it is a very painstaking job. So why do communities, why do they make this effort? And why do we still have a living manuscript tradition today? Those are sort of the questions that I ask in the book. And through these questions, it's also an argument to take the materiality of manuscripts seriously, as well as the social practices that surround them, that have preserved them, that give life, that sort of show us what the social role is of these manuscripts, secret manuscripts, esoteric manuscripts, as, I mean, they have all kinds of social roles. Right, and just a brief picture that I put in here to remind myself. I also have to address the question of gender, which is very important in the book as well. Because I would say in sort of the study of Islamic manuscripts, since we're used to approach manuscripts through the lens of classical philology, obviously a lot has happened in the field, and it's all very wonderful. But I also in the book argue for taking our positionality into account when we go to archives, when we go to libraries. And a lot of people say, yes, but you do anthropological research, that is sort of standard. But actually, for me, this was quite an eye-opener, because I'm not a classically trained anthropologist. And the gender, our gender in a way, and taking that into account, I think is crucial, even if you go to a state library or an academic library, because our relationships that we have with the custodians of libraries, with families that preserve manuscripts, in the end, the decisive factor in what we get to see, what we have access to and what not, and in the end, what the kind of scholarship that we write. And I explore this in depth in the book, but on the one hand, my gender complicated a lot of things. As I said, the access to the manuscripts was extremely problematic and controversial, and people in the community were also, some of them were really against it, because these are sacred manuscripts that cannot be accessed, let alone be touched by people who are ritually impure. Women, by definition, according to Sumaiya law, are ritually impure. So it was very contested. Yet at the same time, because as an unmarried woman who came from very far and didn't have a family to take care of her, the community felt responsible for taking me in. And the Dai also told me at some point, had you been a man, we would have never let you this close. But because you were a woman, we had to take care of you in a way. And it gave me the opportunity to get acquainted to the daily life of the community, as well as gain a trust. But it was a very complex, up till this day, I should say, it's a very complex issue. Right, so returning to sort of the main focus of the book, in a way, my monograph, it sort of documents story of the survival of one of the last living manuscript cultures in the Muslim world. Yes, this book is about a community that identifies itself as Shi'i and Ismaili, but it's part, I think, of a much larger discussion, because, of course, with the advent of print, the many manuscript cultures in Muslim societies disappeared. And of course, some of them are still alive. But they're not many. And well, I'll talk a little bit towards the end of the presentation about sort of the predicaments of that. But the Bohras have truly, and I mean, the other Bohra communities have done that as well, but I had access to the Alawis, have truly preserved a living manuscript culture, and have also preserved one of the last khizanat al-kutub, or treasuries of books. And this term is very important. In fact, I had a slide here. Right. So the term khizana means treasury. And the Bohras still use the term treasury of books, khizanat al-kutub. And there is a very strong reason for this. because the Bohras trace back themselves as a community to their manuscripts, to the imperial libraries of Fatimid Cairo. So we're now talking of the imperial Ismaili power that ruled much of the Mediterranean and North Africa from the 10th till the 12th century. And it is basically, just to show you the map of this transmission history, it's basically this transmission history which I have mapped out in the book. I have looked at, on the one hand, I've looked at how the Bohras themselves identify and trace back sort of their past over the Indian Ocean, from Gujarat to medieval Yemen and over the Red Sea to Fatimid Cairo. But on the other hand, I also looked at the manuscripts themselves, the materiality, the codicology, the bibliography of these manuscripts. And what we see is in sort of this transmission history, that the social role of these manuscripts changed drastically. And I don't want to talk too much about the Fatimids because I know there are many people in the audience who are much more capable of doing that than I am. But what is fascinating, if we keep that image in mind of the Alawi royal khizanat that we just saw, to the Bohras, even though perhaps the social and political and religious contexts are completely different, these are one and the same. And one could be critical about this, whether this is legitimate or not, but the Bohras and the other Bohras do this as well, in perhaps different ways. They through their manuscripts and through this chain of transmission, situate themselves in the larger Shi'i world, in the larger Ismaili world, in the larger Muslim Ummah as heirs of the Fatimids. And this is an interesting claim. Of course, one could argue all kinds of things. Would a manuscript from 10th century Cairo look the same as it would today? We cannot answer this question because we hardly have any material from this period. But to the Bohras, this is what matters. And therefore, the book is also titled Neo-Fatimid Treasury of Books, because as heirs of the Fatimids in the modern era, this is how the Bohras see themselves. And that is quite an interesting claim, because the Bohras are, of course, not the only Ismailis that see themselves as heirs of the Fatimids. In fact, they compete with, for instance, the Nizari Ismailis, who legitimize this claim in the living Imam of the Arakan. The Bohras say, well, we have the evidence of the texts. It's a very interesting discussion. And what we see also in the larger field, I mean, I'm not the only one who has used this term, Neo-Fatimid. This identity is also expressed on various other levels, such as architecture, sartorial practice, and also, as I've been able to sort of trace back in this khizanat in Baroda, you can trace that in the terminology used in manuscripts as well as in the codicology. So that is a little bit what the book does. On the one hand, I'm really looking at the material, trying to trace that back over the Indian Ocean. I find it important to mention also this Indian Ocean aspect. I mean, Sumaiya has just given a paper on this. But so yeah, very good to hear about that. But sort of the Indian Ocean focus of Ismailism traveling over sea rather than over land to the Iranian route is something I think that needs some scholarly attention. So on the one hand, looking at that route, tracing it back to the manuscripts, but on the other hand, also anthropologically observing how the Bohras identify themselves and make these claims. And one of the things I took for granted when I was in Baroda, and later when I came back, I thought, actually, if you think about it, this is quite unusual, is that Fatimid texts, or often the copies of Fatimid manuscripts, of very well-known texts such as Qadi Numan's Daham al-Islam. So this is a text that was sort of the codified state law of the Fatimid Empire, are actively read, preserved, copied, memorized. In fact, everything you find in these texts is actively practiced in Baroda today. And I mean, it's not just Qadi Numan, but there are cupboards and cupboards and cupboards of these manuscripts. What I forgot to mention is the Alawi khizanat consists of roughly 500 manuscripts. and also has a very interesting collection of documents. Now, the other Bohra communities have their own khizanat, have their own clerical establishments. And in fact, the Dawdis, their khizanat, they have actually, in fact, I believe several khizanat, much larger. But the interesting thing is the Dawdis, just as the Alawis, are identifying themselves in the same way, linking themselves to the Fatimids. They read Qadi as well, or al-Kirmani or Sijistani. These sects are alive, and maybe from the sort of paradigm of Ismaili studies, this makes sense. But we are in Gujarat, where most believers of these communities do not know it, except for perhaps Quranic Arabic. This is not, as we say in German, selbstverständlich. This actually, to the outsider, makes no sense. However, if you understand the emic perspective, and that's what I've also tried to honor in the book, that's to me what social codicology is about, it makes a lot of sense. I don't want to go too deeply into this because there's not a lot of time, but there has been a lot of scholarship on what the, so to say, original khizanat, al-kutub, the royal manuscript repositories of the Fatimids could have looked like, how big they were, what they contained. And in the field, for a long time, there has been the paradigm that with the fall of the Fatimid Empire, the libraries were burnt, manuscripts were sold, and we never ever saw them again. Now, through the scholarship of Fazia Bohra and others, we know that this was not the case. Even Konrad Hirschler has discussed this, and that Ismaili manuscript copies continue to circulate on the bookmarks of Damascus, of Cairo, centuries after its fall. However, what happened to these texts afterwards is not known. As far as I know, there's only one manuscript that sort of could be Fatimid, which is a music manuscript. To the Bohra's perspective, again, if we look at sort of the map here, the Bohras see themselves as not only as the heirs, but the saviors of this tradition, because they had already split up from the Fatimids. I won't go into the details of this, following a different imam and settling themselves in Yemen. So in that sense, they see themselves really as the saviors of this tradition. But one can imagine, if you're interested in the question of manuscript cultures and how they change over time, that in that transmission from Fatimid Cairo in the 12th century to medieval Yemen, and then 16th century to Gujarat over the Indian Ocean, which is I've touched upon this in a chapter, but I think there's a lot that can be said about this, a lot more. That, of course, a lot of influences sort of seeped into the tradition. And that, in a way, if we're going to have a look at some of the manuscripts of the khizanat, explains why we have this fascinating, uniquely Arabic, Bohra, Ismaili, Neo-Fatimid, if you will, manuscript tradition. Right, so here we have a few pictures, just to give you an impression of the khizanat in Baroda. And right, this is actually a sign, just to contextualize things a little bit, because I can talk about this, but whenever you enter in the Mohalla of Badri Mohalla is basically the quarter where the Alawis live. This is the first sign you see. It has nothing to do with manuscripts. Fatimid General Store. This is so true. Yeah, I know, and it took me 5 years before I actually saw that. Because I passed it every day, and I never saw them. But yes, you're absolutely right. And
some things get lost in
yes, absolutely. Or you don't see it yourself anymore because you take it for granted, right? So the Fatimid General Store, or Sotra, is a very small little stall at the beginning of the Mohalla, which you sort of encounter when you enter it. And this is where the kids of the Mohalla, myself included, would have ice cream at a very hot day. The days get very hot in Baroda sometimes. And of course, to believers, this is there. They perhaps not even would question this, but this is an example how beyond manuscripts, just in a very simple, mundane day-to-day life, these things are part of what it means to be part of the community. And there are many of these shop signs and businesses that refer to the Fatimid past, whether it's through ice cream or through manuscripts. So we jump really from ice cream into something completely different. I talk a lot about the sort of the sacred materiality of the Bohra manuscript tradition. So the Bohras practice, like any other Shi'i community, they practice taqiyya, which is this dissimulation of one's religious identity. And there's a reason for this, because the Bohras, like other Shi'i and Ismaili communities, what they share is a history also of persecution, whether this was in Yemen and also actually in Gujarat. And actually today, this is still a very relevant topic. And therefore, their manuscripts look different. I recently gave a talk in Gotha, and the sort of the theme of this lecture series was on provenance and on materiality. And these were all scholars who've done fantastic work on manuscript cultures or manuscript libraries, say Mamluk Cairo or Damascus, medieval Damascus. However, these are manuscript cultures, and these are sort of the manuscript cultures that the field is focusing on, because the access is easier, access to this is difficult. But these manuscripts look a certain way because they were produced in centers of power and not in communities that were so-called in the periphery. I don't like the word periphery, but you know what I mean. And therefore, if you study a manuscript culture, when you try to map out a manuscript culture such as the Bohras, manuscripts look different. They have different features, they have different paratexts, and completely different. You find a whole different world in there. That is very different from say, scholarly manuscript traditions produced in scholarly urban elite milieus where you read hadith. Right? This is a completely different tradition. So in their transmission from Fatimid Cairo, say, to medieval Yemen, so we're talking about the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th century, the community who would end up being part of the Bohra community preserved this body of Fatimid literature that reached Yemen. However, within a political context that was not very favorable for this Ismaili community. So there was a lot of persecution, a lot of war, and so forth. And we see that manuscript culture slowly changed. So manuscripts are preserved. There is what I call a khizanat tradition that comes into being in Yemen. And in Yemen, but also later in Gujarat, we see that manuscript culture changes into what I call the materiality of secrecy. And this tradition of taqiyya, it's not just a social practice where perhaps you do not share your religious beliefs, say in times of danger, but we also see that many things in these manuscripts that either are too esoteric or are deemed controversial at the same time are being made secret. So this is an example. I hope no one is offended by this. But what is a typical feature that we find in Bohra manuscripts, as Delia, of course, has also described so many times, is kitab sirriya, as they call it in Baroda, so secret script, or basically secret alphabets that are used to conceal certain things that are controversial. So here we see a very interesting example of social practice on the one hand and how that seeps into manuscript cultures. So in Arabic it reads Abi Bakr la'na'u Allah, which means something like may Abu Bakr be cursed. And so this practice of the la'an is actually very common among many Shi'i communities because, of course, Abu Bakr was not supposed to be caliph in their tradition, right? So, for instance, in Baroda, I've seen this in social practice and also in manuscripts. And it is an example of social codicology where these things come together. So there are many ways in which through which certain aspects of Bohra manuscript culture are being made inaccessible to the outside uninitiated reader. And with that, I don't only mean people from outside the community, but also within. Because imagine if you have one main cleric who's the custodian of these manuscripts, and the only one who can read them, who has access to them, who can copy them. The rest of the community, the believers, actually never get to see these manuscripts, at least not, they never get to read their content. However, at the same time, how do people in these communities know that these manuscripts exist? Because something that is secret only functions when you know that you cannot access it, otherwise it doesn't work. So what we see here is a picture of the Sayyid Nasab. Actually here, this was my little manuscript table, so I would observe everything from here. And what is a common practice in the community is basically being the community members from all over the world come to their dai to give their salams, to basically pay him respect. And sometimes they ask for a dua, a sort of blessing or invocation. And they ask for advice on personal problems. The dai writes talismans. He does all kinds of things. In fact, here we see a father-in-law who's sitting on the floor, who has come to the dai to ask for sort of a cord with knots that is to be worn by his pregnant daughter-in-law around the belly, and the dai actually, in the knots, whispers his blessings, and that is a common practice. However, what we also see, if we look closely here, is that manuscripts, which are supposed to be secret, untouchable, inaccessible, are just laying around. And in the book, I write a lot about sort of the unwritten locks and keys in the community. So like in any social context, there are certain things that have to be respected and everyone knows about it, even if you don't write about it. And I observed time and time again that manuscripts were just laying around. And I believe that is, and perhaps this is the purpose, but believers see the manuscripts laying around. They know these are sacred, we cannot access them. And our dai and Muslims have all these clerics, they are involved in reading them or copying them, but we cannot access them. In fact, there are no locks on these manuscript covers that are found in khizanat. So I argue this is also part of this materiality of secrecy. It is, on the one hand, it is built in the manuscripts themselves, through paratext, through spells, through curses, through all kinds of textual features. And then, of course, there is the social practice. And that is how the khizanat, in a way, functions. And had I studied these manuscripts, say if a copy of this manuscript would end up in the university library or here at SOAS, and had I studied that manuscript in this sterile setting of the SOAS library, I would not have understood the social role that this particular text would play in the community at this time. Right, then there is also a collection of documents that are enshrined. I use enshrined very carefully here, because I think that is sort of what is happening in the khizanat. And I've written about this as well, also in an article I published recently, that in the materiality, in the codicology, but also their terminology and even their social usage, one finds a lot of links again to the Yemeni, Tayyibi, and Fatimid past. I don't think there's too much time to go into it in detail, but one finds certain formulas, for instance, that we find in Fatimid documents. If Fatimid documents, we know much more about documents than manuscripts. And I was actually shocked to see that many formulas that were used in former times by Fatimid caliphs in official decrees and correspondence are still used in Baroda today. And here as well, if we use sort of the social codicological lens, we see the link between the materiality of the text, because this is a scroll, this is not a codex of something that you put away, this is something you orate from. And scrolls in many ceremonies, in many official functions, are actually taken out by the dying assistant and are literally orated from. No one would actually read these, but they're taken out, and it's this act of yeah, sort of it's this performativity, right? Of you take out the scroll, you orate from it, and then it goes back to the back. So we see social practice, we see script, we see codicology, all these things coming together. And then we return again to the Fatimid general store. I would like to end by reading a small bit of the epilogue of the book, where I also talk a lot about this so-called Neo-Fatimid identity of the Bohras. Because I have now presented this to you as sort of one big perfect picture, but I'm also aware of the fact that perhaps the significance of the Fatimid Empire as sort of this, the golden times and so forth, is perhaps not something that one would have found, say, 500 years ago among the community. And I think this awaits much further research. And actually, in the epilogue, I sort of discuss this a little bit. And I write that, coming back also to this idea of positionality and writing a book on the Neo-Fatimid identity of the Bohras, I'm also aware that that contributes to the identity as well, because how do you deal with ethics when you have a community who basically asks you to be their court historian? How do you deal with these questions? How do you, all in the book. And basically what I say about it is that this question of the Neo-Fatimid identity awaits further research. What's clear, however, is that the Bohra notion of Neo-Fatimidism, that it actually, that wittingly or unwittingly, the study sort of plays a part in the new gestion d'héritage by highlighting the connection between the Bohras and the Fatimids through their book culture. So I argue, so I'm aware of how this book may or may not contribute to it. But I argue that it is what the Bohras today, and perhaps not 300 years ago, have chosen to emphasize and flag as significant. And thus I argue that perhaps this idea of Neo-Fatimidism may have changed over time. In other words, the Bohras' articulation of their communal identity has by no means been static or fixed throughout history, as historiographical works from the pre-colonial period have shown. The manuscripts of the khizanat, however, as this study has demonstrated, have always been there. Further research on the articulation of the Bohras' religious identity and the precise dynamics of their Neo-Fatimid turn, so to say, will enable to better trace the root of this phenomenon. This problem, however, is of no direct relevance to the people of Badri Mahalla. The Fatimid General Store is simply the place where one gets kulfi ice cream on a hot monsoon day, while the Dai and the Bai Sahibs, the clerics, uninterruptedly continue their jihad for books. To them, their khizanat al-kutub is and always has been a Fatimid treasury of books in Morocco. Thank you very much.